been a little surprising that they spend less effort complaining about scientists and much more effort complaining about religious people who do not believe exactly as they do. You have to be a literal interpreter of the Bible in order to be a good follower of Exodus and Genesis, and they never notice that it's very peculiar to say literal interpreter. Those two words don't go together. Okay, so they've got this great big museum, and in the museum, what you find is displays. Oh, I guess this came out a little dark. But anyway, they find displays all over the place that talk about this stuff. And this is a big chunk in the middle of the museum, where what you find is on the left there, almost impossible to see. It's part of the museum where they have all this graffiti and all these horrible slogans like "God is dead," etc., splattered all over the place. And they say this is the consequence of abandoning a literal interpretation of the Bible, that all your children will turn into drug addicts and porn fiends. So it's a traditional Christian, let's scare everybody to death about the consequences of believing otherwise. The others, this is hard to see on the right, but they have this amazing display where they have recreated a church. Big chunk of a church sitting there in the middle of the building. With stained glass windows, the fancy doors, etc., and everything. And right next to it, they have this wrecking balls tearing the church down. This is all life-size. It's the centerpiece of the museum. And what's written on it that you can't really see very well there is millions of years. Millions of years is the mantra of evolutionists. If you say millions of years, you are committing a great heresy, a sin against the Bible. And again, I hate to recommend the competition, but yes, if you get on the web, you go to answersingenesis.org and browse through there, you'll find the phrase millions of years everywhere. And it's always shorthand for this is sin, this is evil. Anybody who says millions of years is going to burn in hell. Isn't that charming? What you also find is this sort of pseudoscience all over the place. And this is one of the first displays as you go in there. It's a little model set up where they have a fellow there who can't see very well in the back, who's the creationist, and this guy up here who is suspicious because he's brown-skinned and Asian-looking. You just can't trust these guys. He's an evolutionist. And they are both working on excavating a fossil, which you can sort of see there in the background. And what you find in this display is they have these video screens where each of these people gives their testimony. And what they do is they say, well, we're looking at the same thing. The evolutionist says, well, this dinosaur was killed millions of years ago in some kind of accident, was buried under these river deposits, and gradually his bones were replaced with minerals, etc., etc. The standard stuff, the stuff we understand, the stuff that's been supported by the evidence and experiment. And the creationist gets up and he says, oh, I think this dinosaur was buried in a flood 2,348 years ago. He was quickly covered with mud and buried and protected from the elements there, and now we're digging him out. And they present these two as, these are the alternatives. They act as if our suspicious-looking Asian was giving all the evidence behind his explanation and present it as pure speculation. Whereas the creationist in the back is presenting all of his evidence, which is backed up by the Bible, therefore he is the one that's right. And throughout the museum they hammer on this theme that you have different views because you have different starting points. That the evolutionists start on the left over there with human reason, which is again suspicious. There are quite a few displays that disparage this whole idea of human reason, whereas the creationists are starting with God's Word. And so they're much better. In this museum, they do try to show both sides of the story. Sort of. They don't give you the full details, but they sketch out. So here, for instance, is a display where they say, okay, there's the evolution tree. This is how evolutionists portray the branching tree of descent. That it is a tree, that it's bushy, that there's no, they all get right, and that they minimize the root there. But yeah, they're saying that there's this great diversity of life that all branches from And most of the scientists I would know look at that and say, yeah, sure, that's a reasonable explanation. This is the explanation derived from human reason. Again, that word, reason. That's a problem. Over here on the right is their explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. It's what they determined by God's word. That, for instance, what happened is that there were triceratops once upon a time. And there are many different kinds of triceratops that you can find in the fossil record. So there's a little period of diversification there, where you got multiple forms. So they allow for some branching speciation. And then that white line down in the middle, that's the global flood. All of the triceratops went extinct except for one pair. You know where they were. On Noah's Ark. And then they're willing to allow that there was some diversification after that. And then eventually all the triceratops died. Again, this is a reflection of their very literal interpretation. Because God told Noah to gather 2 of all species, of all kinds, and 7 of each clean species, the usual details. Because they use the word all, they can't fall back on the usual out that many creationists do of saying, well, the reason the dinosaurs went extinct is that they weren't on the ark. According to answers in Genesis, yes, they were on the ark. All those dinosaurs were on the ark. They all made it to land. And again, this is God's word. This is what God told them. I dare anyone, though, to go to the Bible and find triceratops. It just isn't there. So again, interpretation, right? They are doing a literal interpretation, whatever that means. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's this principle of human exceptionalism. Here's another case of this. This is another display where, again, it was reason versus God's word. Everyone in the museum, reason and God's word are in opposition, and you know which one you are supposed to accept. This is their diagram of human and other primates' evolution. And they're very specific about this again, that all those fossils that people are digging up, things like Lucy and Neanderthal man and so forth, those are just apes. Apes diversified, most of them went extinct in the flood, except for, again, the pair that they toddled out. And those then diverged and produced all these forms, including Lucy, Neanderthal man, Homo erectus, anything you can name. That's all over there, and that tree descended from a monkey on Noah's Ark. Which, if you think about it, means that Lucy and Neanderthal man, all these different species, had to have evolved within 4,000 years. Man, however, was created 6,000 years ago by God in God's image and has not changed one bit. So, once again, human exceptionalism. It's the main thing they're concerned about. They're willing to allow lots of evolution in other groups, but not in human beings. This leads them into these situations. This is another display. I've actually shown this at a scientific conference with a bunch of evolutionary biologists who just had a great time with it, because what it is it's basically saying exactly what we teach our kids in biology. Is that if you look at the example of horses, that we have a really good fossil record for horses. We know all these different forms from the early equids through modern horses. We've got all these intermediate forms in there, transitional species, all that stuff. They accept that. They say that's just fine. So they even talk about these different changes in climate and how they drive the evolution of the horse. That could be in a science museum, except for the fact that they say all this happened within 4,000 years. So what they're promoting is actually a kind of evolution on methamphetamines. Evolution on hillbilly heroin. Really fast stuff, where it's zipping along at an incredible rate, which all the biologists, anybody who knows anything about population genetics and evolutionary dynamics knows, well, no, this is not going to happen. But of course, their answer is God provided organisms with special tools to change rapidly. Now, isn't this weird? Because, when you think of creationists, you usually think of people who say, boom, God did it. He created them just this way. That's it.